So let's resume. We're looking at deadweight loss for a positive externality. Okay? Now, the problem with the deadweight loss is you have an underproduction problem here. Now let me show you what I mean by underproduction. Okay? The underproduction takes place because not all the consumers that are benefiting from it are paying. They're represented right here. This quantity represents the amount of marginal private benefit and the intersection of your marginal social cost. Okay? So at this level of output, there's an imbalance. There's an imbalance between the marginal social benefit, which is right here, and the marginal social cost, which is right there. Okay? Now, the goal is to get the two equal, right? Marginal social benefit should be equal to marginal social cost, and if the two are not equal, you will have inefficiency, right? So, what should happen, right? Well, you need to move to social optimal, okay? So how do you move to social optimal? You need to produce more. And as you produce more, what would happen to your marginal social benefits and your marginal social costs? Well, your marginal social benefits will move along this blue line here, okay? So your marginal social benefit will decrease, okay, as your marginal social cost increases, okay? As a result, what happens to your deadweight loss? Well, your deadweight loss will continue to erode. It will continue to decrease as you increase production and get closer and closer to social optimal. The deadweight loss gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it gets to zero. Okay? So, once again, what we just showed you is this relationship between marginal social benefit and marginal social cost when you have a positive externality. One is greater than the other, as you can see. Okay. I also demonstrated what happens to deadweight loss as we increase output. Okay, this was the one we did at your seats. ID, consumer and producer surplus when producing the optimal amount. Okay, so consumer surplus is right, let's see if I can do that really quick. Right there, it's this triangle. Alright, so it's that triangle. It's called consumer surplus. CS. Okay? Consumer surplus. And the bottom one, I don't have to write it in. That's producer surplus. This is when you're at optimal production. Okay? Moving on. Okay, next. It says ID consumer and producer surplus when you're at non-optimal. Okay? So, it would be nice for someone to come up here and do that, but we're kind of running out of time. Okay? So I'll just do it for you, right? So ID consumer and producer surplus when at non-optimal, right? Well, it's everything. It's price. Remember, it's price, okay, up to your demand curve, right? So that's the vertical distance, right? And the horizontal distance is between the origin and the quantity of output, the output level, right? So it's between 0 and market quantity, right? So it's this trapezoid, right? And that is your consumer surplus. Now your producer surplus is just the opposite. It's on the bottom. It's priced down to the supply curve. And that's the vertical distance between those 2 points, right? Between the price and the marginal cost curve. and then you have the horizontal distance between 0 and the quantity of production. Okay? Next. All right. Okay, that's good. Then I had you work on a problem. Kind of running out of time though. So we'll just begin with the next topic. All right, so last thing, you guys, so deadweight loss, right? There's your deadweight loss, okay? If you are, not producing at optimal, right? Okay, any questions about positive externalities and finding the deadweight loss? Okay, let's move on to negative externalities. Okay, what is a negative externality? A negative externality is when you are overproducing. Okay, you're overproducing. You could say pollution would be a perfect example of a negative externality. Okay, so it's a cost that is not, it's not incurred by the buyer or seller. Okay, so the buyer and seller are not paying for their fair share of the costs. Right, so let's take a look at the definition. It's overproduction because the private buyer and seller of output do not pay societal costs, but rather only their personal benefit and personal costs. Okay? That would be an example of any type of pollution, right? All right, so let's take a look at the deadweight loss for this situation. It's a little bit different, okay? So take a look. So notice you have, it's on the opposite side, okay? The deadweight loss is on the opposite side. All right, let's take a look at this in terms of the output. So market quantity over here represents the private, okay? That's where the pollution occurs, right? The private producer, the private consumer, they're only thinking about their own benefits. And so that creates an output of market quantity, right? Now, why is this such a bad thing? Why is it so bad, right? Well, you guys can see it's bad because marginal social cost is not equal to marginal social benefit, okay? The two need to be equal to be efficient, right? Well, in this situation, the cost, right, the red line, is greater than the benefit, the blue line, at market quantity, okay, at the private quantity, right, private output. That's a bad thing, right? Because it's saying that they're producing an output that society doesn't want, right? Now, let me show you visually how that looks. What do I mean by they're producing something that society doesn't want? Okay, so you can look at this. I can tell it's something that society doesn't want because the MSC is greater than the MSB, right? And the problem that creates is it creates overproduction, right? So the solution to it is we need to bring it back to socially optimal. So we need to reduce the marginal social costs. We need to increase the marginal social benefits, okay? And eventually the two will intersect. Okay. Now, this overproduction creates a negative consumer and producer surplus, right? Creates a negative. So let me show you what that looks like. All right, so here's the negative producer surplus. Here's the negative consumer surplus. But you might be saying, well, I thought that was I thought the producer surplus that you're showing me was the consumer surplus and vice versa, right? But no, when you're on the other side, everything is flipped, okay? When you're on the other side, everything is flipped. On the other side of what? On the other side of optimal production, okay? So when you're underproducing, right, you're going to have consumer surplus being above equilibrium. And producer surplus will be below equilibrium, down to the supply curve. But when you're overproducing, the consumer surplus will be below equilibrium, and the producer surplus will be above equilibrium, as you can see. Okay? So, let's just take a look at these prices, right? So the optimal price, okay, is this yellow, it bisects this triangle, right? It's the yellow line. And you'll notice when they're producing at market, right, the producers, right, this is their average revenue, right? Their average revenue is the yellow line. And their average cost is the red line, right? So as a result, we can see that they are negative profits, negative producer surplus, okay? And that's why it's not a good thing for them, obviously. And then on the consumer side, you can see that the yellow price, the yellow line is the average revenue, is the price, okay? But their willingness to pay is below it, okay? So they have negative savings or negative implicit savings. And that's obviously not beneficial to that group either. So you have two situations, two areas that are not beneficial for the consumer, not beneficial to the producer, and therefore this is our deadweight loss. Okay? All right, now what I want you to do on your own, we're not going to have time for this, but I was going to have you, create a model, right, for either a positive or negative externality. This is pollution. I would say, okay, you've got maybe hog farmers and they're stinking up the joint, so to speak, no pun intended, and go ahead and create a model to show if these hog farmers don't really care about the environment, what happens, okay? And then you would answer these following questions. Right? So that would have been an activity I would have done on Twidla. I probably would have, or the answer pad, one of the two. But like I said, we're almost out of time. Okay, guys, so today what did we learn? Okay. All right, so we learned about deadweight loss. And specifically, we learned how to model, okay, a positive and negative externality, right? And that's what you learned today, okay? For homework, on your own, why don't you guys go ahead and have in your notes the models for a positive and negative externality. Make sure you are able to label all the relevant points, okay? Relevant points would be, let me show you, things like this, right? You should be able to do these things, right? Okay. Okay, tomorrow we'll continue with those